Welcome, everybody. As night settles in, let's drift together into the pages of time, unfolding another story from the past. Maybe you're already laying in bed, or simply letting history keep you company before sleep. Where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know the place and hour of yours as these words reach you. And if these gentle tales of lives long ago bring you comfort and rest, I'd be honored to have you stay with me by subscribing this channel. So let's begin. Before empires, before kings, before the very concept of borders, there was only the sky. It was an immense, endless vault of aching blue that the people called the eternal heaven, Khan, a presence so vast it seemed to press down upon the very soul of the world. Beneath it stretched the Mongolian steppe, a sea of whispering grass that rolled in endless waves to every horizon. This was a land of brutal, beautiful extremes, of winters so cold the breath froze in the lungs, and summers so brief and vibrant they felt like a stolen dream. The wind was the land's only constant voice, a mournful sigh that carried the scent of snow in winter and dry earth in summer. This crucible forged a people of incredible hardness and resilience. They lived in jairs, felt-walled tents that could be dismantled and moved in an hour, their lives dictated by the wandering of their herds of sheep, goats, and hardy horses. They were divided into a mosaic of warring tribes, the Tatars, Merkits, Karaits, and Naimans. Their history a tangled, bloody tapestry of raids, betrayals, and vengeance that passed from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. A man's identity was his clan. A man's purpose was to defend it, avenge it, and enrich it at the expense of all others. It was into this world of fractured loyalties and perpetual conflict, in the year 1162, near the winding silver thread of the Onan River, that a son was born to Yasuji, a chieftain of the Borjigan clan. The birth was not an easy one. His mother, Hoelin, a woman of fierce spirit captured from the Okanut tribe, labored in the dim, smoky light of the GR. When the child finally emerged, the midwives gasped. Clutched tightly in his tiny, clenched fist was a blood clot, dark and coagulated, the size of a warrior's knucklebone. The clan shaman, an old man with eyes clouded by smoke and visions, was summoned. He held the clot to the light filtering through the smoke hole. "This one," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle, "has come into the world with his hand closed around a symbol of his destiny. It is not a clot of birth, but a clot of conquest. His life will be written in the blood of his enemies." The air in the tent grew thick and heavy with the weight of the omen. To mark the portent, Yasuji named the boy Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain he had just captured in battle. It was a name of strength, of victory, a name that meant the finest steel. It was a prophecy and a warning. The world of young Temujin was a small, vibrant universe bounded by the felt walls of his family's gur and the vast, open horizon of the steppe. His earliest memories were sensory, imprinted on him like the patterns on a saddle. The sharp, clean smell of horse sweat and leather, the rhythmic, comforting creak of the wooden frame of the gur in the wind, the taste of warm, frothy mare's milk, and the immense, star-dusted blackness of the night sky. He learned to ride almost as he learned to walk, his small body instinctively molding itself to the galloping rhythm of the Mongolian pony. He learned to string a bow made of layered horn and sinew, a weapon that required all his boyish strength to draw. His father, Yasuji, was a stern, distant figure, a man whose authority was etched in the lines of his face and the respect he commanded from his warriors. His mother, Hoelin, was the center of his world, a woman whose hands were both gentle and strong, who could soothe a fevered brow one moment and expertly skin a marmot the next. A pivotal joy of his childhood was his friendship with a boy named Jamuka, the son of a chieftain from a neighboring clan. They met during the seasonal migrations, two boys on the endless plain. They raced their horses until the animals were lathered and breathless, tested their archery skills on wandering hares, and shared secrets in the long grass. One day, in a ritual as old as the steppe itself, they exchanged gifts. Temujin gave Jamuka a small, carefully shaped knucklebone, and Jamuka gave Temujin an arrowhead tipped with fine flint. They mixed a few drops of their blood, swearing an anda, a bond of blood brotherhood, vowing to be loyal to one another for all their lives. It was a pure, uncomplicated bond, a sanctuary of friendship in a world already hinting at violence. This fragile peace shattered when Temujin was 9 years old. Yasuji, returning from a journey, accepted hospitality from a group of Tatar tribesmen. It was a fatal mistake. The Tatars, remembering old defeats, slipped poison into his food. Yasuji rode home, his body racked with agony, and died shortly after, his last breath spent cursing the Tatar name. The return of the grieving family to their camp was met not with solace, but with cold, hard calculation. The Borjigin clan, led by rival relatives, saw Hoelin and her children, Temujin, his brothers Kasar, Kachian, Temuj, and his sister Temulin, along with two half-brothers from another of Yasuji's wives, as a liability. A family without a strong male leader was a drain on the clan's resources, a weakness that could invite attack. One morning, as the camp prepared to move to richer pastures, the family was simply abandoned. The jars were dismantled around them, the wagons loaded, and the clan rode away, leaving Hoelin and her children standing alone on the vast, empty plain, the wind whipping their hair. The message was as brutal as the steppe itself. You are on your own. Overnight, their world collapsed. They became scavengers, surviving on the fringe of survival. They dug for roots with their bare hands, set snares for field mice and marmots, and fished in the icy rivers with crude spears. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. Their bodies grew lean and hard, their eyes acquiring a wary, feral glint. The comfortable life of a chieftain's son was a distant dream. The harshness of their existence bred a terrible tension. Temujin's half-brother, Begtur, began to assert himself, claiming a larger share of the meager food they gathered. The conflict came to a head one afternoon. Temujin and his younger brother Kasar had managed to shoot a small, brightly plumed finch. Begtur, bigger and stronger, snatched it from them. You are children, he sneered. The strong eat. The weak watch. A cold, murderous rage, born of months of hunger and humiliation, filled Temujin. He was no longer a child. He was the eldest son of Yasuji, and this was an insult that could not be borne. He and Kasar, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and fury, stalked Begtur as he stood watch over the family's few scraggly horses. Temujin knocked an arrow, his hand steady. Kasar did the same. As Begtur turned, his eyes widened in surprise. There was no shouted challenge, no dramatic speech. There was only the soft twang of bowstrings and the sickening thud of arrows finding their mark. Begtur fell, his body crumpling into the grass. When Hoelin learned what her sons had done, her face was a mask of grief and grim understanding. She did not weep for Begtur. She wept for the innocents her sons had just slaughtered. She gathered them, her voice low and intense. You have done a terrible thing, she said, her eyes boring into Temujin's. But the steppe is terrible. You have learned its first and most vital lesson. Mercy is a campfire. It keeps you warm, but it also tells your enemies where you are. To survive, you must sometimes be as cold as the winter wind. The lesson was seared into Temujin's soul. Survival was not just about finding food. It was about eliminating any threat, no matter how close it stood. As Temujin grew into a young man, his very existence became a threat. He was the son of Yasujii, and his name, once forgotten, was now being whispered again. The Taikiad tribe, old rivals of the Borjigen, decided to snuff out this potential rival before he could blossom. One dawn, their warriors descended upon the family's small camp in a thunder of hooves and shouts. There was no fight, only a swift, brutal capture. They clamped a heavy wooden kang around Temujin's neck, a portable pillory, a yoke of shame designed to break his spirit and parade his humiliation. For weeks, he was moved from one Taikiad camp to another, a living trophy. Children threw stones and dung at him. Men spat at his feet. He was forced to sleep in the open, the weight of the kang making it impossible to lie down comfortably. The rough wood chafed his neck and shoulders raw. But with each day of torment, the steel within him hardened. He did not beg. He did not cry out. He retreated behind a wall of silence, his eyes dark and intense, missing nothing. He memorized the layout of the camps, the routines of the guards, the faces of his captors. He was not a prisoner. He was a student of his enemy's complacency. His chance came during a feast. The Taikiad were celebrating a successful raid, their bellies full of fermented mare's milk and roasted mutton. The air was thick with laughter and the drone of drunken songs. His guard, a young man named Sorkin Shura, was less vigilant than usual, his head nodding with the effects of the alcohol. As dusk deepened, Temujin saw his moment. With a surge of desperate strength, he lifted the heavy kang and swung it with all his might, the wooden frame cracking against the guard's skull. The man grunted and slumped to the ground, unconscious. Panic and adrenaline lending him strength, Temujin staggered into the darkness, the cumbersome kang making every step a struggle. He could hear the shouts of alarm rising behind him. He stumbled down a riverbank and plunged into the icy water, submerging himself completely, the kang acting as an anchor, with only his nostrils above the surface. He held his breath as mounted warriors galloped along the bank, their torches flickering over the dark water. They passed within feet of him, their voices fading into the night. Half frozen and exhausted, he dragged himself out of the river. He knew he could not survive on the open steppe in his condition. He took a desperate gamble and staggered to the gur of Sorkin Shura, the very guard he had struck. He found the man tending his wound, but instead of raising the alarm, Sorkin Shura looked at the shivering, defiant youth with a strange respect. He saw not a slave, but a leader. He and his family hid Temujin in a cart piled high with wool, and when the search had moved on, they freed him from the kang and sent him on his way with a stolen horse and a bag of food. This escape was more than a flight. It was a rebirth. He had been tested in the fire of humiliation and emerged, not broken, but tempered. He had learned that even among enemies, there could be honor, and that his own was the most powerful weapon he possessed. He rode away from the Taikiad lands, no longer a boy, but a man forged in adversity, his spirit as hard and sharp as the flint in his old friend's arrowhead. The wind that swept across the steppe was colder now, carrying not just the scent of snow, but the bitter taste of isolation. Temujin, free from the Taikiad, was a man without a clan, a ghost on the plains. His family, reunited, was a pitifully small band, their existence a daily struggle against hunger and the elements. Yet, in the depths of his hardship, a single, warm ember of memory glowed. Borte. He remembered her from the brief, bright period of his childhood. His father, Yasujii, had taken him on a journey to the lands of the Anjarat tribe, known for their beautiful women and their strategic position as merchants and mediators between the warring tribes. He was to be betrothed to Borte, the daughter of a chieftain named Sechin. He recalled a girl with intelligent eyes and a quiet strength, a glimpse of a different, stable life. Before leaving, Yasuji had left Temujin with Daisechin, as was the custom, saying, "My son is afraid of dogs. Do not let him be frightened." It was a poignant, human moment from a stern warrior, a final flicker of paternal care. Now, years later, that memory was a compass point. Borte was more than a wife. She was a symbol of legitimacy, a connection to the world of alliances and status he had been ripped from. She was the light that could pierce the darkness of his current existence. With a resolve forged in suffering, he and his brother Kassar mounted their lean, tough horses and set out to find the Angeret. The journey was a testament to his growing knowledge of the land. He navigated by the stars and the lay of the rivers, avoiding the territories of known enemies. When they finally found the camp of Daisechin, the reception was wary. The Angeret remembered Yasuji, but they also knew of his fate and the subsequent fall of his family. They saw before them not a chieftain's son, but a hardened, almost feral young man with the desperate eyes of a wolf. Daisechin, however, was a man of his word. He looked past the ragged clothes and the lean frame, and saw the same iron will that had characterized Yasuji. More importantly, he saw the way his daughter Borte looked at Temujin, not with pity, but with recognition. The betrothal was honored. In a simple ceremony, Temujin received his bride. Her dowry was a priceless treasure, a fine sable cloak. But her true value was her presence. She was his anchor, his connection to a future beyond mere survival. For a few fleeting months, Temujin knew a semblance of peace. He had a wife, a family, and a flicker of hope. This fragile happiness was shattered with the sudden, brutal violence of a summer storm. The Merkit tribe, a powerful and vengeful people, had not forgotten. Years ago, Yasuji had stolen Hoilan from a Merkit warrior. The debt of blood and honor had festered for a generation. One night, as the camp slept, the thunder of hooves announced their vengeance. The Merkit warriors, their faces painted for war, swept through the camp like a whirlwind. There was no time to organize a defense. In the chaos of shouting, clashing steel, and crackling fire, Temujin fought desperately, but he was overwhelmed. He saw Borte, her face a mask of terror, being dragged onto a horse and carried off into the darkness. The Merkits, having achieved their primary goal of capturing the bride, vanished as quickly as they had come, leaving behind smoldering tents and shattered lives. Temujin stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his knuckles white around the hilt of his sword. The feeling of helplessness was a physical pain, worse than any hunger or cold he had ever endured. They had taken his light, but this time, the despair did not cripple him. It crystallized into a cold, focused rage. The personal had become political. The theft of his wife was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war. It was the catalyst that would transform the desperate survivor into a leader of men. He did not weep or cry out to the heavens. He sheathed his sword and began to plan. He knew he could not face the Merkits alone. He needed allies. His mind turned to two key figures, Togrul, Khan of the powerful Karate tribe, who had been his father's Anda, a sworn brother, and his own blood brother, Jamuka. The retrieval of Borte would be his first campaign, a test of his ability to inspire, to lead, and to wield the complex weapons of alliance and obligation. He rode first to Togrul, a man of immense wealth and influence who ruled from a grandeur laden with silks and silver. Temujin did not come as a beggar. He came as Yasuji's son, and he brought with him the most valuable thing he owned, Borte's sable cloak. He presented it to Togrul, a gift of immense worth. "You are my father's sworn brother," Temujin said, his voice steady, his eyes locking with the older man's. "You are therefore as a father to me. I have come to you with this offering, and I ask for your help. The Merkids have stolen my wife. Will you honor the oath you swore to my father?" Togrul, touched by the gift and the boldness of the request, and bound by the sacred code of the Anda, agreed. "For the gift of this sable cloak," he declared, "I will reunite your scattered people. I will restore your wife to your arms." He promised the might of the Karaite cavalry. Emboldened, Temujin then sent a message to Jamuka. The bond of their boyhood oath was still strong. Jamuka, now a rising chieftain in his own right, responded without hesitation. He remembered their games, their vows. He mobilized his own warriors. The combined force that rode against the Merkids was the largest Temujin had ever been a part of. It was not a disorganized raid, but a coordinated military operation planned with Jamuka's tactical acumen. They fell upon the Merkit camp like an avalanche. The attack was swift and merciless. Temujin, fighting with the frantic energy of a man reclaiming his soul, cut his way through the chaos, calling Borte's name. He found her amidst the panicked Merkit women. The reunion was not a dramatic embrace, but a moment of intense, silent communion. Her eyes, filled with the horrors she had witnessed, met his, filled with the violence he had committed. In that look, they understood the world they now inhabited. She was safe, but the victory was complicated. Borte was pregnant. When she gave birth to his son, Joki, the question of his paternity hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. A lesser man might have rejected them both. But Temujin, in a stunning act of pragmatism and loyalty, made a decisive declaration. "He is my son," he stated, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "He is the first of my children. He is Joki, the guest, for he arrived after a long journey." It was a masterstroke. It silenced the gossips, secured Borte's position, and demonstrated a quality that would become his trademark: a ruthless, unsentimental focus on the larger goal. The unity of his family, the core of his future power, was more important than personal pride. The leader had emerged from the fire of his first great trial. He had learned to translate personal grievance into collective action, and he had secured the unwavering loyalty of the woman who would be the mother of his empire. The victory over the Merkits was a baptism of fire and a coronation in the eyes of the steppe. Temujin was no longer just Yasuji's orphan son. He was a war leader who had marshaled the might of the Karaites and his own Anda to deliver a crushing blow to a powerful tribe. A new aura surrounded him, a magnetic field of potency and promise. Followers, disillusioned with the petty squabbles of their own chieftains, began to drift toward his camp. They were the dispossessed, the ambitious, the young. Those who saw in Temujin's meritocratic circle a chance to earn status through loyalty and skill, not merely through birthright. For a time, the camps of Temujin and Jamuka were united, a sprawling city of felt tents stretching across the river valley. The two blood brothers, reunited, seemed an unstoppable force. They feasted together, their shared memories of boyhood blending with the heady wine of recent victory. They slept under the same blanket, as was the custom of sworn brothers, their bond a public spectacle of unity. Jamuka, the more traditionally aristocratic of the two, was the senior partner, his lineage and experience granting him a natural precedence. Temujin, the junior, was the fierce and loyal lieutenant. But two sons cannot share one sky. The very source of Temujin's growing strength, his appeal to those outside the traditional aristocratic hierarchy, began to fray the fabric of their friendship. Jamuka's power was rooted in the old ways, in the unassailable authority of noble blood. Temujin's camp was a living challenge to this order. A blacksmith's son who showed courage in battle could find himself in command of 100 in Temujin's service. In Jamuka's camp, he would have remained a blacksmith. The rupture began subtly, a hairline crack in the foundation of their bond. It was during the great seasonal migration, a time-honored ritual that dictated the rhythm of life on the steppe. The clans had to move their vast herds to new pastures. As they prepared to break camp, Jamuka stood on a grassy slope, a place traditionally reserved for the highborn. He gestured to the rolling hills. "My brothers," he announced to the assembled nobles, "let us pitch our tents here. This is a place of strength for those with strong bones and pure lineages." Temujin said nothing. He returned to his own camp and consulted his mother, Hoelin, the wisest and most politically astute person he knew. She had seen the tension building. "Jamuka speaks of lineage," she said, her voice low and urgent. "But his heart is turning away from you. Do not camp with him on the slope. The slope is for the few. The river valley is for the many. Pitch your tents by the water, where all can drink, where all can feel the cool breeze. Let your people see the difference." It was a masterful piece of political theater. When the migration began, Temujin's followers, taking their cue from him, did not follow Jamuka up the slope. Instead, they drove their herds and wagons down into the open, fertile river valley. The physical separation was a declaration of independence. That night, as Jamuka's campfires twinkled on the high ground like distant, cold stars, Temujin's fires burned in a great, sprawling constellation below. The message was unmistakable. One camp was exclusive, hierarchical. The other was open, meritocratic. The effect was immediate and electric. That very night, a steady stream of Jamuka's followers, lesser nobles, skilled warriors, even entire families, began to slip away from the slopes and descend into the valley to join Temujin. They came not as conquered subjects, but as willing adherents to a new ideal. Among them were men who would become legends in their own right. Baracula, the fearless warrior, Jelm, who would later suck a poisoned wound from Temujin's neck, and Subutai, the son of a blacksmith, who would go on to become one of the greatest generals in human history. They saw in Temujin not just a leader, but a cause. Jamuka watched this exodus from his lofty perch, his heart curdling with a bitter mixture of betrayal and fury. The bond of Anda was the most sacred oath a man could swear, and in his eyes, Temujin had shattered it. He had not drawn a sword against him, but he had stolen his followers, his prestige, his very future. The love he held for his blood brother twisted into a deep, abiding hatred. He did not confront Temujin. He simply broke camp before dawn and moved away, his departure a silent, seething accusation. The break was complete. The steppe, which had seemed too small for two such men, now felt vast and empty between them. The warmth of their shared youth was now a frozen memory. They were now rivals, and the entire Mongolian plateau became the chessboard for their coming struggle. The air itself seemed to crackle with the tension of the impending conflict, a storm gathering on the horizon of the world. The silence that followed Jamuka's departure was heavier than any winter snow. It was a silence filled with the unspoken challenge of a brother turned rival. Temujin did not pursue him. He understood that the battle would not be won with a single glorious charge, but through the slow, deliberate work of building something new, something more resilient than the fragile tribal confederacies of the past. The River Valley camp was no longer just a gathering of followers. It was the embryo of a nation. In the year 1189, with the blessing of his growing coalition and the shrewd counsel of his mother Hoelin, his senior wife Borte, and the loyal warriors who had chosen him, Temujin was formally proclaimed Khan. The ceremony was not held on an aristocratic slope, but in the open by the life-giving river. It was a conscious choice, a reaffirmation of his philosophy. He accepted the title, but he was not a Khan in the old sense. He was an architect, and he began immediately to construct the framework of a state. His first and most crucial innovation was the creation of the Kashik, his personal guard. He selected 80 night guards and 70 day guards, chosen not for their lineage, but for their unwavering loyalty, physical prowess, and skill at arms. These men were lifted from their clans and bound directly to him. They ate from his pot, slept near his gur, and their fortunes were inextricably linked to his own. They were the first professional, standing army in steppe history, the iron core of his power. To be in the Kashik was the highest honor, a testament to a man's worth, not his birth. Next, he imposed a revolutionary military structure, the decimal system. He organized his entire fighting force into units of 10, the Arban, 100, the Zun, 1,000, the Mingan, and 10,000, the Tuman. Commanders of these units, the Noyans, were appointed based on merit and proven loyalty. A man who had been a mere shepherd could find himself leading a Mingan if he had the talent and courage. This system shattered the old tribal affiliations. A warrior no longer fought for his clan chief. He fought for his Arban commander, who answered to his Zun commander, who served the Khan. It was a structure of breathtaking simplicity and efficiency, a machine where every part knew its place and function. He also established a rudimentary capital, a place of governance he called a Varga, a mobile city of jars that could move with the seasons but serve as a central administrative point. Here, he began to codify his laws, the early tenets of what would become the Great Yasa. Theft of livestock, a common cause of interclan feuds, was declared a capital crime. Desertion in battle was punishable by death. He appointed a chief judge, his brother-in-law Shehiko, to adjudicate disputes according to this new, universal law, bypassing the traditional, often biased, judgments of clan elders. This new order was a direct threat to every traditional power structure on the steppe. It could not go unchallenged. Jamukha, watching Temujin's state building with growing alarm and fury, gathered his own coalition of tribes who feared this upstart and his dangerous new ideas. The pretext for war came when Jamukha's younger brother, Taichar, was killed while trying to steal horses from Temujin's camp. It was a provocation Jamukha was all too eager to embrace. The two armies, each representing a different vision for the future of the steppe, met at a place called Dalambaljit. Temujin's force, though disciplined, was outnumbered and less experienced in large-scale set-piece battles. Jamukha's army was a traditional tribal confederation, but it was vast. The battle was a brutal, day-long affair. Temujin's decimal units held their formation with a disciplined Jamukha's men found unnerving. But Jamukha was a cunning tactician. He feigned a retreat, drawing a portion of Temujin's army into a reckless pursuit, then turned and enveloped them. The battle turned into a bloody stalemate, then a slow, grinding defeat for Temujin. As dusk fell, he was forced to sound a retreat, his army melting away into the gathering darkness, leaving the field and many of his loyal followers to Jamukha. The defeat was a severe blow, but not a fatal one. As Temujin and his battered forces retreated, Jamuka committed an act of stunning brutality that would ultimately prove to be his political undoing. He took 70 of Temujin's captured captains and, in a grotesque parody of steppe tradition, had them boiled alive in 70 cauldrons. He believed this display of terror would cement his power. He was wrong. The story of the boiling cauldrons spread across the steppe like a grass fire. It was not seen as strength, but as monstrous, wasteful cruelty. Temujin, in contrast, was known for his mercy to those who submitted and his ruthless but targeted punishment of his enemies. Jamuka had revealed himself as a tyrant of the old, vicious order. Temujin's defeat at Dalanbaljit, paradoxically, began to burnish his reputation as a more just and civilized leader. As Temujin licked his wounds, he analyzed his defeat. He had learned a vital lesson. Discipline and innovation were not enough without superior numbers and experienced command. He had also seen the fickleness of some tribal allegiances. He would not make the same mistake again. He began to rebuild, his resolve hardened, his vision clearer. The standard of the 9 white yak tails may have been soiled in the mud of Dalanbaljit, but it was not broken. It would fly again, and next time, the wind would be at its back. The years following Dalanbaljit were a time of strategic retreat and patient consolidation for Temujin. He was like a wolf licking its wounds in a hidden cave, its yellow eyes never leaving the flock. He knew that to challenge the established order of the steppe, he needed more than just a loyal army. He needed the sanction of heaven and the support of its most powerful earthly representative, Togrul, Khan of the Karates, his father's Anda. Togrul's court was a world of gilded decadence, a stark contrast to the austere discipline of Temujin's camp. The Karate capital was a semi-permanent city of jars draped in Chinese silks and Siberian furs. Togrul, now an old man, was often indecisive, swayed by the last voice in his ear. The most influential of these voices belonged to his son, Sungum, a jealous and arrogant prince who saw Temujin's growing renown as a threat to his own inheritance, and to the shaman, Kokochu. Kokochu was a man of immense presence. He had taken the title Tebtingri, supreme heavenly, and claimed to ride a dappled gray horse to the heavens to speak directly with the eternal blue sky. His influence over Togrul was absolute. He moved through the camp with a retinue of acolytes, his eyes seeing not the physical world, but the swirling spirits that lay just beyond it. He viewed Temujin's new, merit-based system as a threat to the old spiritual order he embodied. For a time, a fragile peace was maintained. Temujin, ever the pragmatist, played the loyal vassal. He fought Togrul's wars, recovered his stolen herds, and publicly deferred to the old Khan. He even proposed joining their families, offering his son Joki in marriage to Sengum's daughter. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, but Sengum, consumed by envy, haughtily refused. "My daughter will not live in the camp of a mere keeper of sheep and goats," he sneered. The insult was public and profound, but Temujin swallowed it, his face a mask of calm. He was playing a long game. The conspiracy against him began to coil like a serpent. Tebtingri, the shaman, saw his chance to eliminate his rival. During a grand ceremony, he fell into a trance, his body writhing, foam speckling his lips. He spoke in a guttural, otherworldly voice. "The eternal sky has spoken. It has decreed that Togrul and Temujin shall rule the people together. But if they do not support each other, their fates will be as uncertain as the weather, their power as insubstantial as a shadow." The message was deliberately ambiguous, a poison dart aimed at the heart of their alliance. To Togrul, it sounded like a divine mandate for shared rule. To Temujin's followers, it sounded like a threat. The shaman's true aim was to create a dependency, to make Toghrul believe he could not rule without Temujin, while simultaneously making Temujin's legitimacy contingent on Toghrul's favor. It was a recipe for suspicion and, ultimately, conflict. The plot thickened. Sangam, growing impatient, devised a more direct scheme. He sent a message to Temujin, proposing a final reconciliation and a formal marriage alliance between their children. It was a trap, as Temujin and a small retinue rode to the meeting place. They were warned at the last moment by two humble herdsmen of the betrayal. Sangam's army lay in ambush. What followed was a desperate, running battle known as the Battle of the Kalakaujit Sands. Temujin and his handful of guards were surrounded, outnumbered 20-1. They fought like cornered animals, their survival depending on the speed of their horses and the deadly accuracy of their arrows. Temujin's quiver was emptied, his horse shot from under him. He commandeered another, fighting on as the day wore on. As dusk fell, a sudden, freak dust storm enveloped the battlefield, a zud of such intensity that friend and foe were blinded. In the chaos, Temujin and a few survivors managed to slip away, their bodies aching, their throats parched with dust and thirst. They found refuge at the muddy waters of Lake Baljuna. Here, at their lowest ebb, starving, hunted, their coalition in tatters, Temujin and his most loyal followers performed the Baljuna covenant. They shared a single, scrawny wild horse, drinking its blood and eating its flesh. They swore a sacred oath, vowing eternal loyalty to each other, a bond forged not in victory, but in shared desperation. This small band of brothers from diverse tribes and religions became the unshakable core of his power. Their loyalty was not to a tribe, but to the man who had led them through hell and back. Meanwhile, believing Temujin dead or permanently broken, Sangam and Toghrul celebrated. Their victory seemed complete, but they had underestimated their enemy's resilience and his ability to inspire loyalty. As Temujin recovered, messengers were sent to every corner of the steppe, reminding his old allies of their oaths and revealing the treachery of the Karaite rulers. The final confrontation came swiftly. Temujin, his forces miraculously reconstituted, met the Karaite army in a decisive battle. The discipline of his decimal system proved superior to the traditional Karaite horde. Toghrul and Sangam fled the field, but were later killed by other tribesmen who saw no profit in sheltering a defeated and treacherous Khan. With the Karaites defeated, Temujin faced his final internal enemy, Tebtingri. The shaman, his power base gone, came to Temujin's camp, still arrogant, still claiming his divine authority. A tense confrontation unfolded in the Khan's own jar. Tebtingri sat, uninvited, in a place of honor between Temujin's younger brothers, Kasar and Temuj. It was a blatant challenge to the Khan's secular authority. Kasar, a man of immense physical strength and short temper, had endured enough. As Temujin looked on, his face an unreadable stone, Kasar rose, grabbed the shaman by the neck, and dragged him from the door outside. In the bright, unforgiving sunlight, a struggle ensued. Tebtingri's back was broken against a cart. He was left to die, his body cast aside. There was no divine retribution. The eternal sky remained silent. The message to every man, woman, and child on the steppe was unambiguous. There was only one source of power now. The spiritual would serve the temporal. The shaman's power had been an illusion, broken by the hard, unyielding reality of the state Temujin was building. The path to the Kurultai of 1206 was now clear. The silence that fell after the death of Tebtingri was different from any that had come before. It was not the silence of fear or of mourning or of anticipation. It was the deep, profound silence of a vacuum being filled. With the Karates broken, the Teachids subdued, the Tatars annihilated, and the Naimans and Merkits scattered to the winds, the endless, chaotic symphony of tribal conflict on the Mongolian steppe had ceased. The last dissonant note, the shaman's claim to a rival spiritual authority, had been silenced. The very air seemed to hold its breath. From every corner of the now pacified land, the word went out. Riders on lather horses, their chests heaving, carried the summons to every Arban, every Zun, every Mingan. Commanders, Noyans, and simple warriors who had proven their loyalty were to assemble. They were to gather at the source of the Onan River, the sacred heartland, the place where the first ancestors were said to have emerged from the womb of the earth. A great Kurultai was to be convened. The journey to the Onan was a pilgrimage. They came in their thousands, a river of humanity flowing across the steppe. No longer were they separate streams, Borjigin, Jadaran, Uriankai, Okanut. They were a single tide. They rode on tough Mongolian ponies, their felt jers packed onto ox-drawn carts that creaked across the prairie. They wore the finery of 100 conquered tribes. Sable furs from the northern forests, silver-inlaid saddles from the western mountains, silks taken from the caravans of the south. The air was thick with the dust of their passage and the lowing of countless herds. As they arrived, a city of tents sprang up on a vast plain, a temporary metropolis organized with the flawless efficiency of the decimal system. At its center, on a small rise overlooking the winding silver thread of the Onan, a great pavilion of white felt was erected. Before it, a massive standard was planted firmly in the rich, black earth. It was a pole taller than 9 men, from which hung 9 white yak tails, their silken strands stirring in the wind. The tug, the battle standard, was a symbol of united strength. The white symbolized peace and purity, the 9 tails the 9 great tribes that had been forged into one people. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of awe, triumph, and solemnity. On the appointed day, the assembled multitude gathered before the pavilion. There were no chairs. They stood, a vast sea of faces, hard-faced warriors with eyes squinted against a lifetime of sun and wind, their hands calloused from bowstring and rain. Women who had endured starvation and loss, their faces etched with a strength as formidable as any weapon. Children who had known only war, now wide-eyed at this unprecedented peace. Temujin emerged from the pavilion. He did not wear a crown or jewels. He was dressed in the practical garb of a warrior. Leather boots, deal robe, a simple fur hat. But his presence commanded the field. He walked to the standard and stood before them, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people he had united. Then, the senior shaman, a man who had accepted the new order, stepped forward. He raised his arms to the eternal blue sky, his voice a resonant chant that carried across the silent crowd. People of the felt walls, hear the will of the eternal heaven, Munkan. The sky has a sun. The earth has a lord. The one who has suffered, who has been tested in fire and ice, who has been abandoned and betrayed, yet who has endured. The one who has crushed the proud and raised the humble. The one who has brought justice to the lawless and order to the chaos. The sky has granted dominion over all the peoples who dwell in tents to this man. He is the punisher of the wicked, the protector of the righteous, the Lord of all who dwell under the sun. He turned and faced Temujin, bowing low. The eternal heaven has spoken. You are chosen. You are the Khan. A roar erupted from the tens of thousands of throats, a sound so immense it seemed to shake the very earth. It was not a cheer, it was an acclamation, a release of decades of pent-up anguish and hope. Swords were raised, their blades flashing in the sun. The cry was taken up, wave after wave. Khan, Khan, Genghis Khan. The name was new. It was a title. Genghis. Its meaning was multifaceted, powerful, and deliberately chosen. It meant fierce, hard, unyielding. It meant oceanic, vast, and boundless in his power. He was Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. As the acclamations slowly subsided, Genghis Khan spoke. His voice, which had once been the voice of a desperate orphan, then a war leader, was now the voice of sovereign. For generations, he began, his words clear and carrying, we have been a scattered people. We have fought each other, tribe against tribe, clan against clan. Our strength was wasted, our blood spilled for nothing. We were a fist with the fingers clenched, unable to grasp our destiny. No more. He paused, letting the silence emphasize his words. Today, we are one nation, the Mongol nation. From this day forward, there are no Borjigin, no Taykid, no Karates. There are only Mongols. Our law will be the Yasa, which I will give you. It will be a law for all, from the highest Noyan to the lowest herdsman. In its justice, you will find security. In its order, you will find prosperity. He outlined the pillars of his state, the very systems he had tested and refined over years of struggle. The decimal army, the Kashik, the Yam messenger system, the religious tolerance for all who submitted, the meritocracy where a man's worth was his ability, not his bloodline. Look around you, he commanded, his arms sweeping across the horizon. The world is vast. The eternal heaven has given us a destiny that does not end at the next river or the next mountain. We have been given a world to set in order. We have been given an empire to build. The Kurultai lasted for days. It was a time of feasting, of horse races, of wrestling matches. But beneath the celebration was the hard work of statecraft. Genghis Khan confirmed his commanders in their positions. He appointed his 4 hounds of war, Subutai, Jib, Kublai, and Jelm, to lead his armies. He distributed the spoils of past victories with a scrupulous fairness that cemented the loyalty of his followers. On the final day, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, Genghis Khan stood once more before the standard of the 9 white tails. The forging of the sword was complete. The steel had been tempered in the fires of betrayal, hammered on the anvil of war, and quenched in the waters of unity. It was now sharper and stronger than any blade the world had ever seen. The Mongol Empire was born, and its edge was now turned outward towards the waiting world. The euphoria of the Kurultai did not last. For Genghis Khan, the proclamation was not an end, but a beginning. He had unified the people of the Felt Walls, but he knew that a nation forged in war could just as easily shatter in peace. The old tribal jealousies were not dead, merely sleeping. The steppe was quiet, but the silence was fragile. He had to bind this volatile new empire with something stronger than personal loyalty or the memory of past victories. He had to bind it with law. In the months that followed, the great mobile capital at Varga became a center not just of military planning, but of intense, deliberate statecraft. Genghis Khan summoned his most trusted advisors, his brothers Kasar and Temüj, his sons Joki, Chagatai, Ogidi, and Talyui, and his hounds of war. They gathered not in a grand palace, but in the Khan's own spacious gur, its felt walls insulating them from the outside world, the air thick with the scent of mutton fat and smoke. Scrolls of birch bark and pressed paper, taken from conquered scribes, were spread before them. Here, clause by clause, decree by decree, the great Yasa was hammered out. It was not a gentle code. It was the iron framework of the state, a reflection of the harsh steppe that had bred them. The law must be as clear as the sky and as hard as the earth, Genghis Khan declared, his voice low but absolute. There will be no confusion, no exceptions. A scribe, a captured Uyghur who now served the Khan, carefully etched the words. On theft, the man who steals a horse or a sheep from his comrade shall be returned the value 9 times over. If he cannot pay, he shall forfeit his life. For we are a people of herds, and he who steals from the herd steals from the life of the nation. This was a revolutionary concept, replacing the endless blood feuds with a standardized, brutal, but definitive punishment. On military service, every man from the age of 15 to 70 is a soldier. He shall report to his Arban commander when the call to arms is sounded. The man who deserts his Arban in battle, or who fails to aid his comrade, shall be executed. The unit that fails is the unit that is purged. This created a system of collective responsibility that made the army a single, cohesive organism. On spies and lies, the man who acts as a spy or who bears false witness shall be put to death. Truth is the thread that holds the tent together. A single lie can unravel it all. On authority, the word of the Khan is the law. The word of your Noyan within the law is your command. To question them is to question the order of the eternal heaven. But within this brutal simplicity lay a revolutionary meritocracy that was read aloud with equal force. On rank, no man shall be born to command. A man who shows courage in battle and wisdom in counsel may rise to command a Tuman, even if his father was a slave. A man who is born a prince but shows cowardice shall be made a herdsman. This was the core of his power, the reason why men of talent from every conquered tribe flocked to his banner. On religion, the Khan believes in one eternal heaven, but all men may worship as they choose, for the sky has many faces. Let no man persecute another for his faith. This decree of tolerance would become a strategic masterstroke, allowing him to rule over diverse populations without inciting religious revolt. The Yasa was proclaimed throughout the land. Messengers of the newly formed Yam network, riding fresh horses between relay stations spaced a day's journey apart, carried copies to the farthest corners of the new empire. The laws were read aloud at gatherings, the harsh penalties searing themselves into the consciousness of every man, woman, and child. To enforce this new order, Genghis Khan turned his Kashig from a personal guard into a national police and administrative corps. They were his eyes and ears, empowered to arrest any man, from a common soldier to a powerful Noyan who broke the Yasa. Their loyalty was solely to him, and their authority was absolute. The effect was transformative. The random violence and petty feuds that had characterized steppe life for centuries began to vanish. A traveler could now journey from the Kenyan mountains to the Altai with his goods unmolested, knowing that the Khan's law protected him. A sense of unprecedented security, of Pax Mongolica, began to settle over the land. The yoke of Genghis Khan's law was heavy, but it was also just, and it brought a peace the steppe had never known. He turned his organizational genius to the very fabric of society. He ordered a great census, the numbering of the people. Every family, every herd of animals was counted. This was not for taxation alone, but for the most efficient mobilization of the empire's entire resources. He knew exactly how many soldiers he could field, how many horses he could muster, how much food he needed. Watching this bureaucratic machine take shape, his son Chagatai, a stern and traditional warrior, grumbled, "Father, we are conquerors, not scribes. Our strength is in our bows, not in these bits of paper." Genghis Khan fixed him with a piercing gaze. "A wolf hunts with its teeth," he replied, "but it is its pack that brings down the great elk. We are a pack, and a pack must have order. Without the Yassa, we are just another tribe of wolves, fighting over a single carcass. With it, we can hunt the world." The sword of the Mongols was now sheathed in the scabbard of the law. The steppe was no longer a collection of warring camps. It was a unified, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient nation, poised for its next, inevitable step, to test its strength against the ancient, walled civilizations that lay beyond the sea of grass. The Yassa was the foundation. The conquest to come would be its proof. For 3 years, the Mongol nation hummed with the industry of a stirred beehive. The Yassa was the rhythm of life, the decimal system its structure, and the Kashig its stinging defense. But a hive, no matter how well ordered, must eventually swarm. Genghis Khan's gaze, which had turned inward to build, now turned outward to conquer. It settled upon the oldest, wealthiest, and most arrogant civilization the steppe had ever known, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were the successors to the Khitan Liao, a people who had themselves once ridden from the north. But generations of living behind stone walls, surrounded by the decadent luxuries of conquered China, had made them soft. They ruled from Zhengdu, a city of unimaginable size and splendor, and they viewed the steppe tribes as unruly children, barbarians to be manipulated, played against one another, and contained behind their great wall, a staggering serpent of stone and mortar that slithered across mountains and valleys. The pretext for war came from the Jin themselves. A new Jin emperor, Xuanzong, had ascended the throne. He sent an envoy to the Mongol Kurultai, not with gifts of congratulations, but with a demand for submission. The envoy, a cultivated Mandarin with long, polished fingernails, spoke with a veiled contempt that did not go unnoticed. "The Son of Heaven, the Emperor of the Jin, rightful ruler of all under heaven, commands a Mongol chieftain to appear at his court in Zhengdu and perform the kowtow, acknowledging his vassalage." A deadly silence fell over the assembled Mongol commanders. Genghis Khan did not rage. He turned his back on the envoy, a gesture of supreme insult, and walked to the opening of his jar. He looked south toward the land of the Jin. He is said to have spat upon the ground, a glob of phlegm sinking into the hard earth. "Tell your emperor," he said, his voice calm but carrying, "that the only thing I will kowtow to is the eternal blue heaven, and tell him that his wall of jade is about to crack." In the spring of 1211, the swarm moved. The Mongol army, a force of over 100,000, descended upon the Jin frontier. The sight of the Great Wall, a man-made mountain range, might have daunted a lesser people. But to the Mongols, it was just another obstacle. They did not assault the heavily fortified gates. Like water, they found the weak points. Scouts, who had spent years posing as merchants, identified remote, crumbling sections and undefended passes. Small, agile units scaled the walls with ropes and grappling hooks at night, silencing the watchmen and opening the way for the main army. In other places, they simply bribed the corrupt and disillusioned frontier commanders who saw the writing on the wall. Once through the wall, the Mongols unleashed a new kind of warfare upon the Jin. The Jin armies were vast, slow-moving behemoths, reliant on heavy infantry, cumbersome siege engines, and rigid, classical tactics. The Mongols were a whirlwind. Their cavalry, divided into 2 months, moved with a coordination that seemed supernatural. They would appear before a city, their scouts mapping every ditch and well, then vanish back into the landscape. The first great clash was at the pass of Yihuling, the Wild Fox Ridge. The Jin sent a massive army, confident in their numbers and their position in the fortified pass. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan's personal command, feigned a panicked retreat, luring the eager Jin vanguard out of their defenses and into a narrow valley. As the Jin ranks became compressed, the main Mongol force, which had hidden on the surrounding heights, unleashed a storm of arrows. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Jin army was annihilated, its commanders dead, the path to the North China Plain laid open. The Mongol strategy was one of psychological and economic devastation. They systematically ravaged the countryside, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and driving terrified refugees towards the walled cities. These refugees carried tales of the demonic horsemen and consumed the city's food supplies, sowing panic and famine. Cities that surrendered immediately were spared, their artisans and skilled workers sent back to Mongolia, their populations taxed but left alive. Cities that resisted were made an example of. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, was the ultimate test. The city's walls were 40 feet high and 30 feet thick, manned by thousands of soldiers. For the Mongols, it was a new kind of warfare. They had no experience in reducing a city of this magnitude. But Genghis Khan had prepared. His corps of engineers, composed of Chinese and Muslim captives who had been treated well and offered a place in his new order, built trebuchets and catapults. They dug siege mines under the walls. They used the refugees as human shields, forcing them to fill the moats with earth and stone. The siege dragged on for months, then a year. Inside Zhongdu, conditions became unbearable. Disease ran rampant. The streets were filled with the dead and dying. The air was thick with the stench of decay and despair. Finally, in the summer of 1215, the city capitulated. The gates were opened. Genghis Khan did not enter the city immediately. He waited. He allowed his army to pour into Zhongdu, a calculated release of pent-up fury and greed. For days, the city was subjected to an orgy of plunder and destruction. Palaces were stripped, temples desecrated, libraries put to the torch. The accumulated wealth of centuries was loaded onto ox carts bound for the steppe. The Jin emperor had already fled south, a phantom ruler of a broken kingdom. When the worst of the violence had subsided, Genghis Khan rode through the smoldering gates. He passed through streets littered with rubble and corpses, his face impassive. He saw the towering pagodas, the intricate lacquer work, the gardens now trampled into mud. It was a civilization of breathtaking beauty and profound weakness. He had not come to rule here, not yet. He had come to break its spine, to prove that no wall, no army, and no empire was safe from the will of the Mongols. He summoned the surviving Jin ministers. Your emperor thought he was the center of the world, he told them. He thought his walls were eternal. Tell him, and tell all who will listen, that the world is larger than he dreamed, and it now has a new master. The fall of Zhongdu sent a shockwave across Asia. The message was clear. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The barbarians were no longer at the gate. They were in the throne room. The wall of jade had not just cracked. It had been shattered into a million pieces. And through the breach, the horsemen of the eternal sky saw a whole world waiting. The spoils of Zhongdu filled the Mongol treasury with a river of gold, silk, and jade. But for Genghis Khan, the conquest of Aegean was unfinished business. The emperor had fled south, and the subjugation of southern China would require a different kind of war. He turned his administrative genius to the task, consolidating his rule in the north, appointing loyal officials, and integrating thousands of Chinese engineers and scribes into his burgeoning imperial machine. The steppe empire was learning to govern a sedentary world. It was during this period of consolidation that a new and ultimately catastrophic challenge emerged from the West. The Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Muslim state ruled by Shah Muhammad II, controlled the heart of Central Asia, from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River. It was a realm of fabulous wealth, built on the Silk Road caravans that passed through its bustling cities, Bokhara, Samarkand, Merv. The Shah, flush with power and hubris, saw himself as the second Alexander. In 1218, seeking to open peaceful trade, Genghis Khan dispatched a formal caravan of 500 merchants, a mix of Mongols and Muslims loyal to him, to the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar. They carried goods of immense value: sables, gold, silverware, and a letter from the Khan to the Sultan Muhammad, great king of the West. The letter began, a masterpiece of diplomatic pragmatism crafted by the Khan's scribes. I send you greetings. I know your power and the vast extent of your empire. I rule the lands of the sunrise, as you rule the lands of the sunset. Let there be peace and trade between us. Let merchants travel safely. I hold you as my beloved son. The message was a formula of equality, but to Shah Muhammad, a man of immense pride, the phrase "my beloved son" was an intolerable insult. He was the shadow of God on earth, not the child of a pagan steppe chieftain. The caravan arrived at Otrar, governed by a relative of the Shah named Inalchuq, who bore the title Gayer Khan, the obstinate king. Inalchuq, a greedy and suspicious man, saw not merchants but spies. He arrested the entire party, confiscated their goods, and sent a message to the Shah in Samarkand, accusing them of espionage. The Shah, without investigation, sent back a single, fateful command: execute them. Inalchuq carried out the order with relish. The 500 merchants were put to the sword. Their bodies were left for the vultures. Their wealth was absorbed into the governor's coffers. By chance, one man, a camel driver, managed to escape the slaughter. He hid among the reeds of the Sir Daria River, then began a desperate, months-long journey east, back to Mongolia. He arrived at Genghis Khan's camp half dead from exposure and hunger, his story a tale of betrayal that turned the air cold. Genghis Khan was enraged, but he was a ruler, not a mere warlord. He controlled his fury. He sent a second embassy, this time of 3 men, a Muslim and 2 Mongols, to the Shah's court in Samarkand. Their mission was to demand justice, the surrender of Governor Inalchuq for punishment. The Shah's response was even more monstrous. He had the chief Mongol ambassador beheaded. The other 2, both Muslims, he sent back to Genghis Khan after burning off their beards, a gesture of supreme contempt in the Islamic world. When the humiliated envoys stood before him, their faces raw and blistered, the last thread of Genghis Khan's patience snapped. The cold, calculating ruler vanished, and the primal force of the steppe emerged. He climbed a nearby mountain, alone, and for 3 days and 3 nights he prayed and fasted, communing with the eternal heaven. He removed his hat and belt, symbols of his authority, and pressed his forehead against the earth. "Eternal heaven!" he cried out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "You are my witness. I did not seek this war. I saw peace. I saw trade. But they have spilled the blood of my envoys, who are as my own eyes and tongue. They have insulted your chosen one. Grant me the strength to exact vengeance. Let my wrath be your wrath. He descended from the mountain a man possessed. The war with the Jin was put on hold. Every resource of the empire was redirected west. This would not be a war for conquest or plunder. It would be a war of annihilation, a jihad in the name of the violated law of nations. The caravan of 500 merchants had become a caravan of doom. It was now headed straight for the heart of the Khwarezmian Empire. In the spring of 1219, the greatest army the world had yet seen began to move. It was a multi-ethnic force of over 200,000 men. Mongol cavalry, Chinese engineers, Turkish auxiliaries. They moved not as a horde, but as a coordinated machine, its parts communicating through the flawless Yam network. They carried with them not just bows and siege engines, but the cold, focused fury of their Khan. The storm that had broken the wall of jade was now turning its fury upon the cities of Islam. The world was about to witness the full, terrifying price of insulting Genghis Khan. The march west was a spectacle of terrifying precision. The Mongol army, a nation on horseback, moved like a tide of disciplined locusts, its passage marked by a rising cloud of dust visible for days. Scouts, the eyes of the army, ranged hundreds of miles ahead, mapping every oasis, every mountain pass, every potential ambush site. The Yam riders darted back and forth, carrying messages that kept the vast, separated corps in perfect coordination. This was not a raid. It was the methodical advance of an elemental force. Shah Muhammad II, in his gorgeous palace in Samarkand, was gripped by a fatal indecision. His empire was vast, his army large, but it was a fractious collection of feudal levies, its loyalty divided between the Shah and powerful, independent-minded generals. His strategy, born of arrogance and poor intelligence, was his doom. Instead of concentrating his forces to meet the Mongols in a decisive battle, he scattered them, garrisoning them in his great fortified cities, believing they would be safe behind their high walls and that the Mongols would exhaust themselves in futile sieges. He failed to understand that he was not facing a traditional steppe army, but a sophisticated military machine with a corps of engineers who had mastered the art of reducing cities. The first city in their path was Otrar, the site of the original insult. For 5 months, the city held out under the stubborn defense of Inalchuq, the obstinate king. The Mongols, in no hurry, systematically sealed off the city, built their siege engines, and dug tunnels under the walls. When the city finally fell, the vengeance was personal and brutal. The garrison was massacred. Inalchuq was captured alive. Brought before Genghis Khan, he was shown no mercy. In a symbolic punishment for his greed, the Khan ordered molten silver poured into his eyes and ears until he died in screaming agony. Otrar was then razed, its very stones scattered, a warning to the next city on the path. That city was Bokhara, the noble city, a center of Islamic learning and piety. The Mongol army appeared before its gates with shocking speed. The garrison, seeing the fate of Otrar, lost its nerve and attempted to break out. They were cut down in the open field by the waiting Mongol cavalry. The city elders, hoping for mercy, opened the gates. Genghis Khan rode into the city center to the great mosque. He was a man of the steppe, and the concept of a city of stone was alien to him. He mounted the pulpit, his boots dusty from the road, and addressed the terrified populace who had been herded into the square. "People of Bokhara," his words were translated by a captured scribe. "I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The statement echoed through the stunned silence. It was the pronouncement of a divine mandate for destruction. The city was given over to plunder. The great library, containing countless priceless manuscripts of philosophy and science, was put to the torch. The flames consumed the accumulated knowledge of centuries, the smoke a black pillar of mourning for a dying civilization. The skilled artisans, weavers, metalworkers, carpenters were separated from the rest and sent east to serve the empire. The rest of the population was driven before the army as human shields for the next siege. That siege was Samarkand, the capital, the jewel of Islam. It was defended by a vast garrison, including a unit of war elephants. The sight of the horde of refugees from Bokhara, their tales of horror spreading panic, did more to break the defenders than any Mongol arrow. After a short, fierce resistance, a faction within the city opened the gates. The Shah had already fled, a king without a kingdom, his spirit broken. The sack of Samarkand was systematic and complete. The Mongols, true to their word, were the flail of God. The streets ran with blood, the gutters choked with the dead. The great observatory was destroyed, its astronomical instruments smashed. The war elephants, symbols of the Shah's power, were commandeered and used to carry loot. Genghis Khan, watching the destruction, is said to have turned to his sons and said, "The joy of man is in the conquest of his enemies. To root them out, to take their property, to ride their horses, to deprive them of their loved ones, to feast on their tears." The pursuit of the fleeing Shah Muhammad became an obsession. He was a phantom, fleeing from city to city, his retinue shrinking with each passing day. The Mongol generals Subutai and Jeeb, the Flying Arrow, were given a special force of 20,000 men with a single mission: hunt him down. The chase was relentless, a grim fox hunt across Persia. The Shah, abandoned by his own court, his own family, died of despair on a small, desolate island in the Caspian Sea, his empire in ruins around him. His son, the courageous Jalal ad-Din, took up the fight, but it was too late. The final act of the Khwarezmian campaign was the most horrific. The city of Urgench, a wealthy trading center, put up a desperate street-by-street resistance. The fighting was so fierce that the Mongol casualties were unusually high. When the city finally fell, Genghis Khan's wrath was absolute. He ordered the entire population driven out onto the plain. The artisans, as always, were separated. Then, the soldiers were divided among the army and systematically slaughtered. The killing took days. The city itself was then put to the torch. But the Mongols went a step further. They breached the dams on the Amu Darya River, diverting its waters to flow over the smoldering ruins, obliterating Urgench from the map and turning it into a swamp. A river of blood had flowed through the heart of the Islamic world, and a library of ashes was all that remained of its greatest cities. The Khwarezmian Empire was not just conquered, it was erased. The message was sent to every corner of the known world. The laws of Genghis Khan were absolute, and the price for breaking them was utter, total, and terrifying oblivion. The dust of Samarkand had not yet settled. The ashes of Bokhara still smoldered, but for two of Genghis Khan's most formidable generals, the war was not over. It was about to transform into something far more extraordinary. Subutai, the strategic mastermind, and Jeeb, the flying arrow, renowned for the speed and audacity of his cavalry, were summoned to the Khan's command jar. The air inside was thick with the scent of victory and ambition. Genghis Khan's gaze was fixed on a map sketched on cured leather. "The Shah is dead," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "But his son, Jalal ad-Din, has the heart of a lion. He has fled south toward the Hindu Kush. He must not be allowed to regroup. You will hunt him, But your mission is more than this. His finger traced a line west, across the great salt desert of Persia, into lands no Mongol had ever seen. You are the eyes of the empire. I send you not to conquer, but to see, to learn the lay of the lands beyond, to test the strength of the kingdoms that lie in the path of the setting sun. You're to be a reconnaissance in force, a probe into the unknown. Thus began one of the greatest military expeditions in history. Subutai and Jeeb, with a hand-picked force of 20,000 of the empire's finest 2 months, became the embodiment of the Mongol strategic genius, a self-contained, fast-moving army capable of living off the land, gathering intelligence, and striking with devastating force. They caught up with Jalal ad-Din on the banks of the Indus River. The prince, with his back to the water, fought with the desperate courage of a cornered wolf. The battle was fierce, but the Mongol discipline was unbreakable. Jalal ad-Din, seeing his army disintegrating, performed a feat of legendary bravery. He spurred his horse off a high cliff into the raging Indus River, his shield on his back, and swam to the far shore, escaping the Mongol arrows that peppered the water around him. Subutai, watching him go, is said to have told his men, "Such a son should a father be proud of." They did not pursue him across the river. Their mission lay elsewhere. Turning north, they entered the Caucasus Mountains, a world of jagged peaks and deep valleys utterly alien to the steppe-born Mongols. Here, they encountered the Kingdom of Georgia, a Christian realm famed for its heavy cavalry, the knights who had crusaded in the Holy Land. The Georgians, confident in their armored might, charged the Mongol horsemen. It was a repeat of every battle against heavy cavalry. The Mongols feigned retreat, drawing the Georgians into broken terrain, then enveloped and annihilated them with arrows shot from a distance. The Georgian army was shattered. Emerging from the Caucasus, they found themselves on the vast, open Pontic-Caspian steppe, the homeland of the Cumans, a Turkic people related to the Kipchaks. The Mongols, back in their element, crushed the Cumans with ease. The Cuman Khans fled west, into the lands of their old enemies, the Russian principalities, begging for help. A terrible people has come from the east, they warned. They are invincible. Their plea united the notoriously fractious Russian princes. A coalition army from Kiev, Gallic, and Chernihiv, alongside the Cuman survivors, marched east to meet this new threat. The two forces met at the Kalkar River in 1223. The Battle of the Kalkar River was a masterpiece of Mongol deception. A small Mongol vanguard engaged the Russian vanguard, then feigned a panicked retreat. The Russians and Cumans, believing they had the enemy on the run, broke formation and pursued for days, stretching their lines and exhausting their men and horses. They fell headlong into a perfectly laid trap. The main Mongol army, hidden in a depression, rose up and surrounded them. The battle was a chaotic slaughter. The Russian princes were captured alive. The Mongols built a wooden platform, laid the captured princes beneath it, and held a victory feast on top, slowly crushing them to death as they celebrated. It was an act of calculated terror designed to paralyze the West with fear. But Subutai and Jeeb were not conquerors, not yet. They were scouts. Their mission was complete. They had traversed thousands of miles, defeated every army sent against them, and gathered priceless intelligence on the geography, politics, and military capabilities of Russia, the Caucasus, and even the fringes of Europe. They turned east, and in a wide, sweeping arc, they returned to the Mongol heartland, their force intact, their minds filled with maps of the world. Their return was a triumph of a different kind. They brought not just plunder, but knowledge. They reported to Genghis Khan on the great rivers of the west, the Dnieper and the Volga, on the walled cities of the Rus, on the forests and the plains. They told him of the weakness of the Russian princes, their constant infighting. They described the lands as rich, fertile, and ripe for the taking. Genghis Khan listened intently. The pursuit of Jalal ad-Din, the Wind, had opened a whole new frontier. The world, he now knew, was even larger and more fragmented than he had imagined. The campaign had been a perfect demonstration of his strategic doctrine. Know your enemy, know the land, move fast, and strike where least expected. The path west was now clear. The knowledge gained by Subutai and Jeeb would lie dormant for a decade, a seed planted in the mind of the Khan, waiting for the right moment to sprout into a storm that would engulf Eastern Europe. The pursuit was over. The planning for the next great wave of conquest had just begun. The Great Hall of Avarga was a symphony of power. Sunlight, filtered through the smoke hole of the vast ceremonial gur, fell upon heaps of silk, glinted off piles of silver, and illuminated the faces of the most powerful men on earth. Subutai and Jeeb had returned, their tales of western rivers and fractured kingdoms adding new layers to the mental map of the empire. The Khwarezmian campaign was a closed, bloody chapter. For a man in his 60s, Genghis Khan had achieved more than any conqueror in history. He could have rested. He could have spent his remaining years administering his vast domains from the comfort of this nascent capital. But the steppe does not breed men who rest. A wolf that stops hunting dies. And there was one piece of unfinished business that gnawed at him, a betrayal that had festered for years. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, the first sedentary state he had subdued a decade and a half earlier, had grown complacent. When he had summoned them to provide troops for the great Western campaign against Khwarezm, they had delayed, prevaricated, and finally refused. Their ambassador, a man with a carefully cultivated air of condescension, had given a feeble excuse. If the great Khan lacks even enough soldiers, how is he fit to be a ruler? The insult was a spark on tinder dry grass. It was not just a refusal. It was a challenge to the very foundation of his authority, the loyalty demanded by the Yasa. To let it pass would be a signal of weakness, an invitation for every other subject kingdom to rebel. Xixia had to be made an example of one final, brutal lesson in the cost of defiance. He announced his decision to his sons and generals. The Tanguts have broken their oath. They have forgotten the taste of fear. I will remind them. There was a finality in his voice that brooked no argument. His body was showing the strains of a lifetime in the saddle. Old injuries ached. His eyes were set in deeper wrinkles, but his will was undimmed. This would be his last campaign. The mobilization was a familiar, terrifying ritual. The Tumans assembled. The drums of the Mater beat, and the great standard of the 9 white yak tails was unfurled. But this time, the Khan did not lead from the front with the fiery energy of his youth. He rode in a specially constructed carriage, surrounded by his kashig, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of grim purpose. The empire marched west once more, but its spirit was somber. This was not an adventure. It was an execution. The campaign was swift and merciless. The Tangut cities, which had once surrendered after a show of force, now resisted with the desperation of the doomed. They knew the price of their betrayal. The Mongols, their siegecraft perfected over a decade of reducing the greatest cities of Asia, battered down walls, and stormed breaches with cold efficiency. The Tangut army was cornered and annihilated in a series of pitched battles. The Mongols were no longer just conquerors. They were the instrument of a singular, focused wrath. It was during the siege of the Tangut capital, Zhongxing, that the inevitable finally happened. The years, the wounds, the unimaginable strain of a life lived at the extremes of human endurance caught up with the Great Khan. During a hunt, an activity that had been his first teacher in strategy and his lifelong passion, his horse stumbled, throwing him hard to the ground. The impact was severe, causing massive internal injuries. He was carried back to his camp, his body broken, his legendary strength seeping away. He knew he was dying. The steppe, which had given him life, was claiming him back. In his command tent, surrounded by the bitter scent of medicinal herbs and the silent grief of his sons, he dictated his final wishes. His voice was a whisper, but the iron will behind it was unmistakable. "Keep my death a secret," he commanded. "Do not let the Tanguts know. Let them surrender, believing I am still alive. Once their king is in your power, execute him. Eradicate the royal line. Leave no focus for future rebellion." It was the ultimate act of pragmatism, a final command from beyond the grave to ensure stability. He then turned to the future of the empire. He confirmed his third son, Ogdi, as a successor, seeing in his even temper a better guarantor of peace than the fiery Chagatai or the brooding Joki. "Follow the Yasa," he breathed. "Remain united. The strength of the wolf is the pack." On August 18th, 1227, the heartbeat of the 13th century stilled. Genghis Khan, the flail of God, the oceanic ruler, was dead. The news was suppressed, as ordered. The siege continued. The Tangut king, believing he was negotiating with a living Khan, surrendered. He and his entire court were promptly executed. The kingdom of Xixia was systematically erased from history, its people scattered, its cities destroyed, its very name stricken from the records. Then, and only then, did the mournful procession begin. His body, encased in a lead coffin, was carried by his most loyal Kashi guards on a long, secret journey back to the Mongolian homeland. The funeral procession killed every person they encountered on the route, from a chance-met merchant to a wandering herdsman, to ensure the absolute secrecy of the burial site. They brought him to the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, the place where he had hidden from the Merkits as a youth, the place he had designated as the spiritual heart of his empire. In a hidden valley, they dug his grave. He was buried with a simple bow, a sack of mare's milk, and a handful of seeds from his favorite horse. No grand mausoleum was erected. Instead, 1,000 horses were driven back and forth over the site until the earth was trampled flat and indistinguishable from the surrounding grassland. Then, to complete the concealment, a river was diverted from its course to flow over the grave. The exact location of Genghis Khan's tomb was swallowed by the land he loved, a secret kept by the eternal sky. The world knew a titan had passed, but the empire he built, the systems he put in place, the fear and the legend, were only beginning their journey. The wolf was dead, but the pack, disciplined, hungry, and now leaderless, was about to decide if it would hunt as one or tear itself apart. The last hunt was over. The struggle for the inheritance had just begun. The death of Genghis Khan was a seismic event that sent no tremor. The empire, that vast, intricate machine he had built, continued to function on the momentum of his will. The siege of the Tangut capital was concluded with chilling efficiency, the royal line extinguished as per the final command. The army, its grim task complete, began the long march homeward, a serpent coiling back upon itself. But at its head was an empty saddle. The news was a poison held in the mouth, too dangerous to swallow. The senior generals and princes, Talyui, who had been with his father at the end, Chagatai, stern and ambitious, Ogdi, the designated heir, and the thousands of Noyans maintained an absolute conspiratorial silence. The Yam riders, usually the arteries of imperial communication, carried only routine dispatches. To the outside world, the Khan was merely ill, convalescing in his mobile camp. This deception was the first test of the system he had created. Could it survive its creator? The journey back to the Mongol heartland was a funeral procession disguised as a military withdrawal. The lead coffin, hidden in a simple supply cart, was guarded day and night by the sworn members of the Kashig, their faces as impassive as stone idols. Around them, the army moved with its customary discipline, but a palpable tension thrummed beneath the surface. Men who had laughed and boasted on the march west now rode in silence, their eyes darting towards the closed carriage that supposedly carried their recovering leader. Whispers began to circulate, fueled by the absence of the Khan's commanding presence. The air itself felt heavy, waiting for the storm to break. They reached the sacred waters of the Onan River, the site of the great Kurultai that had proclaimed him Genghis Khan. It was here, in the late summer of 1227, that the truth was finally revealed. The generals and princes gathered in a closed council. Talyui, his face etched with grief and the weight of his secret, confirmed what many had already feared. The news spread through the camp not as a shout, but as a sigh, a long, collective exhalation of disbelief and dread. The mighty tree had fallen, but there was no immediate explosion of violence, no bloody scramble for the throne. The Yasa, the iron law of Genghis Khan, held firm. It prescribed a period of mourning and, crucially, a Kurultai to elect a new great Khan. The empire entered a state of suspended animation. For 2 years, the business of governance continued under the regency of Talyui, the youngest son, who administered the empire with a scrupulous loyalty to his father's memory. The decimal armies remained at their posts. The Yam network continued to carry its messages. The conquered territories, unaware of the power shift at the center, paid their taxes and obeyed their Mongol-appointed officials. This interregnum was a testament to the genius of Genghis Khan. He had not built a personality cult that would die with him. He had built an institutional framework so robust it could function even without its head. The loyalty of the army was to the system and the Golden Family, not just to one man. The shared trauma and triumph of the campaigns had forged a collective identity stronger than any tribal allegiance. Finally, in the autumn of 1229, the Great Kurultai was convened. Once again, the plains near the Onan River were transformed into a city of tents. Princes, generals, and Noyans from every corner of the empire arrived. The atmosphere was vastly different from the triumphant unity of 1206. This was a political assembly, charged with the unspoken anxieties of succession. The principal contenders were the 4 sons of Borte. Joki, the eldest, was dead, but his sons, particularly the formidable Batu, represented his line. Chagatai, the second son, was a fierce traditionalist and a brilliant commander, but his temper was volatile, and he had never hidden his contempt for Joki's disputed paternity. Ogdi, the third son, was known for his generosity, his diplomatic skill, and his capacity for drink and good company. Talyui, the youngest, was the most militarily gifted after his father and had the loyalty of a large portion of the army. Chagatai stood and spoke first, his voice challenging. The legacy of our father must be protected by strong hands. We must follow the Yasa without deviation. His gaze swept the assembly. a clear implication that Ogdi's more relaxed nature was a weakness. It was then that Yelu Chukai, the wise Khitan advisor whom Genghis Khan had prized, stepped forward. He was a scholar among warriors, a man of scrolls in a world of swords. Princes of the Golden Family, he began, his voice calm but carrying. The eternal sky has taken the great hawk, but a hawk does not have just one fledgling. Genghis Khan, in his wisdom, saw the path ahead. He did not choose the sharpest claw or the loudest cry. He chose the wing that could carry the flock the farthest. He chose Ogdi. The debate lasted for 40 days. There were feasts, hunts, and whispered negotiations in the shadows of the Jairs. Talyui, putting the stability of the empire above his own ambition, threw his crucial support behind Ogdi. He knew his own martial prowess was needed for future conquests, not bogged down in administration. The will of the great Khan, combined with Talyui's support and Yelu Chutsai's diplomacy, carried the day. Ogdi was proclaimed the second great Khan of the Mongol Empire. The oath of allegiance was sworn. The standard of the 9 white tails was raised for him. The silent bell had finally been struck, and its tone, while different from the first, was clear and strong. The succession had been peaceful. The empire had passed its first great test. The machine built by Genghis Khan had proven it could choose its own new driver. The hunt could continue. The acclamation of Ogdi Khan did not signal a retreat into consolidation. The empire, its succession secured, was a bowstring drawn taut, needing only a target. The memory of Subutai in Jeeb's great reconnaissance, the pursuit of the wind, burned in the strategic mind of the Mongol High Command. The West, with its fractured principalities and rich river valleys, was a prize waiting to be taken. The knowledge gathered a decade earlier was now a blueprint for conquest. In 1235, a great Kurultai was convened at Karakorum. The new permanent capital Ogdi had built, a symbol of the empire's transition from a steppe confederation to a world power. The decision was made. A massive force, the largest field army the Mongols had ever assembled, would be sent to subjugate the lands beyond the Volga. It was to be led by princes from across the Golden Family, a unifying enterprise. Batu, son of Joki, whose Ulus would form the core of the new western domain. Gayuk, son of Ogdi. Monk, son of Talyui, and others. The overall strategic command, however, was given to the old master, Subutai, now in his 60s but with a mind as sharp as a freshly honed saber. This campaign would be his masterpiece. The army that moved out in 1236, the Fire Horse of Mongol prophecy, was a multi-ethnic juggernaut. At its core were the battle-hardened Mongol Tumans, but it was supplemented by Turkish auxiliaries, Chinese siege engineers, and Persian sappers. It was a traveling university of warfare, a self-sufficient society on the move. They crossed the frozen Volga River, a seemingly impossible feat, and fell upon the Russian principalities, which had done little to unite or prepare in the years since the Khalkha River disaster. The city of Ryazan was the first to feel the storm. Its prince received a chilling ultimatum: submit and pay a tenth of all you own. Resist, and we will take everything. The Ryazans, relying on their wooden walls and Slavic courage, refused. The siege lasted 5 days. The Mongols used their captives as human battering rams, forcing them to fill the moats and scale the walls under a hail of their own countrymen's arrows. When the city fell, it was erased. The chroniclers wrote that, "No, I remain to weep for the dead." Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful Russian state, was next. Its grand prince, Yuri II, fled to gather an army, leaving his family in the capital. the Mongols surrounded Vladimir. In a calculated act of psychological terror, paraded his captured son before the walls before executing him in full view of the defenders. The city was then stormed. The prince's family and the entire nobility perished in the final conflagration within the Cathedral of the Assumption, a holy site turned into a funeral pyre. Yuri's hastily gathered army was cornered and annihilated at the Sit River. He died in the fighting, his head presented to Bataclan. The crown jewel, Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, fell in 1240 after a relentless siege. The Mongol bombardment was so intense, a chronicler noted, that the sound of the cracking walls drowned out the prayers of the people. The city was taken street by street, its magnificent churches looted and burned, its population slaughtered or led away into slavery. The Dnieper River, it was said, ran red. The once proud Russian principalities were now broken vassals, their princes forced to journey to the Volga, to kowtow to Bataclan and receive their patents of rule. But Subutais' vision stretched far beyond the Russian forests. His goal was the heart of Europe itself. In a breathtaking display of strategic audacity, he split his forces into multiple columns to invade Central Europe simultaneously, preventing the Christian kingdoms from uniting. One army, under Bidar and Khadan, swept into Poland. They crushed the chivalry of Duke Henry II of Silesia at the Battle of Legnica. The Polish and German knights, clad in heavy plate armor, were utterly outmaneuvered by the swift Mongol horse archers. They were cut down in droves, their charge dissolving into a chaotic melee of slaughter. Duke Henry was beheaded. His head, impaled on a spear, was paraded before the walls of the city. The main force, under Subutai and Batu, drove into Hungary, a kingdom whose plains resembled the Mongol homeland. King Bela IV had gathered a massive army, the largest in Europe since the Crusades. The two forces met at the Mohi Plain near the Sejo River. Subutai, the master of deception, repeated the tactics of Kalka on a grander scale. He left a visible but weak force at a stone bridge to fix the Hungarian attention. Under cover of night and a smokescreen created by burning reeds, the main Mongol army crossed the river at a ford miles away, flanking the entire Hungarian camp. At dawn, they attacked from multiple sides. The Hungarians, trapped in their fortified but cramped camp, were massacred. The Mongols used their siege catapults to hurl pots of Greek fire and naphtha into the chaos, turning the camp into an inferno. The Hungarian army was annihilated. King Bela fled for his life, pursued by a dedicated Mongol detachment all the way to the Adriatic coast. A phantom king hunted across his own ruined kingdom. By the winter of 1241, Central Europe lay defenseless. The gates to Germany, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire were unbarred. The Mongol scouts probed to the outskirts of Vienna. Panic swept through Christendom. The Pope in Rome called for a crusade, but no army could be gathered. It seemed the tide of Mongol conquest would wash unopposed to the Atlantic. Then, in December 1241, as the Mongols prepared their spring offensive, a yam rider, his horse lathered and near death, arrived at Batu's headquarters on the Danube. He carried news from the heart of the empire. The great Khan Ogedei was dead. The law of the Yasa was absolute. Every prince and senior commander was required to return to Mongolia for the election of the new Khan. The greatest military campaign in European history ground to a halt. Batu, Subutai, and the princes immediately turned their armies around and began the long journey east. The western tide, which had seemed inexorable, receded as suddenly as it had come. Europe was saved not by its knights or its kings, but by the death of a single man in a distant capital and the unbreakable political discipline of the empire he had founded. The fire horse had scorched the earth, but the wind from the steppe had called it home. The retreat from Europe was not a rout, but a disciplined, strategic withdrawal. The Mongol armies, like a receding tide, left behind a shattered landscape and a legacy of pure terror. Batu Khan established his capital at Sarai on the Volga River, founding the Kipchak Khanate, which the Russians would later call the Golden Horde. From here, he would rule the Russian principalities for centuries, his shadow looming over their history. But the heart of the empire was convulsed by a new struggle, one fought not with bows, but with whispers, intrigue, and poison. The death of Ogdi Khan created a power vacuum that threatened to tear the Golden family apart. His widow, Torajin Khatan, assumed the regency. A woman of formidable will and cunning, she was a shadow Khan, ruling from behind the curtains of the court in Karakoram. Her sole objective was to secure the succession for her son, Gayuk, a proud, arrogant, and sickly prince who viewed his cousin Badu with seething jealousy. Torajin's regency was a masterclass in political manipulation. She dismissed her husband's capable ministers, like the wise Yelu Chukai, replacing them with sycophants and her own allies. She used the treasury to buy the loyalty of the princes and generals, creating a web of obligation that stretched across the empire. For nearly 5 years, she stalled the convocation of a Kurultai, consolidating her power and neutralizing her opponents. The empire, built on the clear, harsh logic of the Yasa, was now adrift in the murky waters of court politics. When the Kurultai was finally held in 1246, it was a stage-managed affair. Torajin's faction dominated, despite fierce opposition from the sons of Talyui and the Jochids, who saw Gayuk as a tool of his mother. Gayuk was proclaimed the third great Khan. His reign began under a cloud of illegitimacy. He was paranoid, vengeful, and physically weak, his body racked by alcoholism and illness. He immediately moved against his rivals, launching an investigation into the conduct of a European campaign, a clear threat aimed at Badu. The empire teetered on the brink of civil war. But Gayuk's reign was short. In 1248, as he marched west at the head of a massive army, ostensibly to confront Batu, he died mysteriously in the Xinjiang region. The whispers were immediate and universal. He had been poisoned. The empire was now leaderless once more, and the factions sharpened their knives. From this chaos emerged a new, unexpected power, the House of Talyui. The key figure was not a warrior, but a woman, Sorgatani Beki, the widow of Talyui and mother of Monk, Kublai, Hulagu, and Eric Boke. A Nestorian Christian of impeccable Karaite lineage, Sorgatani was the thorned rose, a figure of immense grace, intelligence, and political acumen, with a core of absolute steel. While the sons of Ogdi and Chagatai squabbled, Sorgatani played a long and brilliant game. She had always been a loyal supporter of the imperial idea, administering her own lands with a justice and efficiency that won her widespread respect. She cultivated the loyalty of the army commanders who had served with her husband and sons. Most importantly, she secured the alliance of the most powerful man in the West, Badu Khan. Badu, who had no desire to be great Khan himself, but would not accept another enemy on the throne, saw in Sorgatani a reliable ally. He threw his immense influence behind her son, Monk. In 1250, Badu summoned a preliminary Kurultai at his own encampment on the Alakol Lake, where Monk was preemptively elected. This was a bold challenge to the traditional authority of Karakoram. The opposition, led by the houses of Ogidi and Chagatai, refused to accept this. A standoff ensued. It was Sorgatani who broke the deadlock. She used her network of spies and her wealth to persuade, cajole, and threaten the wavering princes. She reminded them of the legacy of Genghis Khan and the danger of disintegration. Finally, in 1251, a full Kurultai was convened at Kodo Errol on the Caroline River. Surrounded by Monk's loyal troops and with Badu's unequivocal support, Monk was proclaimed the fourth Great Khan. The purge that followed was swift, bloody, and comprehensive. It was the empire's St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The Ogedid and Chagadid princes and their chief supporters were arrested, tried in sham courts for treason and witchcraft, and executed. The House of Ogedi was effectively wiped out as a political force. The old guard was decapitated. Monk Khan, a serious, hard-working, and ruthless ruler, owed his throne to his mother's genius. Sorgatani Beki had not drawn a sword, but she had won the most important succession war in the empire's history. She had ensured that the Toluid line, the line of her sons, would inherit the world. On her deathbed in 1252, she could look upon her work with satisfaction. She had saved the empire from civil war and placed it in the hands of her capable sons. The Thorned Rose had ensured that the shadow of Genghis Khan would now fall through her bloodline. The stage was set for the empire's final, explosive acts of conquest. The coronation of Monk Khan was more than a change of ruler. It was a restoration. The empire, after the decadent drift of Gaiuk's reign and the corrosive regency of Torjin, was to be returned to the austere, expansionist principles of its founder. Monk was a man cut from the same cloth as his grandfather. Disciplined, pragmatic, and possessed of an insatiable appetite for conquest. He immediately announced his intention to complete the work Genghis Khan had begun: the utter subjugation of the Song dynasty in southern China and the extension of Mongol power to the very edges of the known world. To lead this final, glorious surge westward, he turned to his brother, Hulagu. The assignment was monumental: to subdue the Islamic world beyond the already conquered Khwarezm, to pacify Persia, and to crush any remaining power that dared defy the Great Khan. Hulagu, a man of immense ambition and organizational skill, was given an army of unprecedented size, drawn from every corner of the empire. It included not only the finest Mongol and Turkish cavalry, but the most advanced siege corps in the world, staffed by 1,000 Chinese engineers expert in building and operating trebuchets, catapults, and incendiary weapons. The march west in 1253 was a spectacle of calculated power. This was not a horde, but a moving capital. Hulagu traveled with his senior wives, his administrators, and a retinue of scholars. He moved slowly, methodically, ensuring his supply lines were secure and his communications with Karakorum flawless. His first target was not a kingdom or a caliphate, but a legend: the Order of the Assassins, the Nizari Ismailis. For 2 centuries, the assassins had held the world in a grip of terror from their mountain fortresses in Persia, most famously Alamut, the Eagle's Nest. Their power was not in armies, but in the fear instilled by their dedicated Fidant, who carried out political murders from Syria to Mongolia. They were the masters of a new, intimate kind of warfare, and they believed themselves untouchable in their rocky eyries. As Hulagu's army advanced, the Grand Master of the Assassins, Rukn al-Din Kersha, a young and inexperienced leader, watched with a mixture of arrogance and anxiety. He sent emissaries with gifts and vague promises of submission, playing for time, believing the Mongols would find the mountains impassable. He fatally misunderstood his enemy. The Mongols did not respond to threats or intimidation. They were an impersonal force of nature. Hulagu's response to the emissaries was blunt. "We have come. You will surrender your fortresses stone by stone. There is no negotiation." The siege of Alamut began in the autumn of 1256. The fortress was a masterpiece of military engineering. Perched on a sheer rock spire, its granaries and water cisterns capable of withstanding a years-long blockade. To the assassins, it was impregnable. To the Chinese engineers in Hulagu's army, it was a complex problem to be solved. The Mongol strategy was one of overwhelming, systematic force. They did not merely blockade. They built roads up the mountainsides to bring their massive siege engines within range. They constructed wooden platforms on the cliffs to station their archers. Day and night, the great counterweight trebuchets, the cargo trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing over 200 pounds, hammered at Alamut's walls. The sound was a constant, terrifying thunder that echoed through the valleys, a drumbeat of doom for the old order. The Mongols also used psychological warfare with devastating effect. They launched projectiles over the walls, not just stones, but pots of naphtha that exploded in sheets of Greek fire and the decapitated heads of captured fighting from outlying castles. The message was clear: your terror tactics are useless against us. Inside Alamut, despair set in. The legendary invincibility of the fortress was being dismantled before their eyes. The young Imam, Rukn al-Din, realizing the futility of resistance, surrendered. He came down from his eagle's nest and prostrated himself before Hulagu. He was treated with courtesy, but his fate was sealed. Hulagu, following a now familiar pattern, was initially lenient. He sent Rukn al-Din to Karakorum to pledge his submission to Monk Khan. But once the assassin fortresses had been systematically demolished, their walls thrown down, their libraries of esoteric knowledge burned, their networks broken, the Imam had outlived his usefulness. On the long road back from Mongolia, Rukn al-Din and his entire family were put to death by their Mongol escort. The order was wiped out. The fall of the assassins was a profound psychological victory. It demonstrated that no power, no matter how mysterious or feared, could stand against the organized might of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols had not just conquered a group of fortresses, they had conquered an idea. They had proven that fear itself was a weapon that could be broken. With the old man of the mountain gone, the path was now clear for Hulagu's ultimate objective, the heart of the Sunni Muslim world and the city that symbolized its power, Baghdad. The Siege of Stars was over. The Siege of the Faithful was about to begin. With the mountain fortresses of the assassins reduced to rubble and their myth of invincibility shattered, Hulagu's gaze turned south, towards the jewel he had been commanded to pluck. Baghdad, the legendary city of peace, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. For over 5 centuries, the Caliph had been the spiritual successor to the Prophet Muhammad, a symbol of unity for the entire Sunni Muslim world, even if his temporal power had waned. The current Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was a man of weak character, more interested in poetry and pigeon racing than in the grim realities of statecraft and war. Hulagu, a man who respected power and despised weakness, began with a formality. He sent an ultimatum to Baghdad, couched in the diplomatic language his grandfather had once used with the Shah of Khorasan. It demanded submission, the dismantling of the city's defenses, and the caliph's personal appearance at the Mongol camp. Within the marble halls of his palace, Al-Mustasim vacillated. His Grand Vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a Shia who may have secretly sympathized with the Mongols, advised caution and negotiation. The caliph's military commanders, arrogant and blind to the changed nature of the world, scoffed at the threat. The armies of the faithful are countless, they boasted. The wrath of God will protect his caliph. Al-Mustasim, in a fatal display of hubris, sent a dismissive reply. He warned Hulagu that the armies of Islam would gather from Morocco to India to defend the city, and that any attack would provoke the anger of the entire Muslim world. It was the answer Hulagu had hoped for. The stage was set for a lesson in total war. In November 1257, the Mongol army, a multi-ethnic force of over 150,000 men, began its final advance. They moved with the same methodical precision that had characterized all their great campaigns. Engineers scouted the terrain, mapping the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. Siege trains, carrying prefabricated parts for trebuchets, rumbled across the plains. By mid-January 1258, Baghdad was surrounded. The city's defenses, though formidable, were undermanned and its commanders divided. Hulagu's strategy was a masterwork of siegecraft. His Chinese engineers built pontoon bridges to cross the Tigris, isolating the city. They constructed a palisade and a ditch around the entire circumference, sealing every exit. Then the bombardment began. The Mongols employed a new level of artillery terror. They used counterweight trebuchets, massive engines that could hurl projectiles with terrifying accuracy and force. They launched not only stones but also pots of naphtha, which burst into inextinguishable flames, and containers filled with diseased animal carcasses to spread sickness. The bombardment was relentless day and night. The great libraries and universities of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, which had preserved the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Persians, were among the first targets. Their priceless manuscripts consumed by fire, the ink of philosophers mixing with the blood of the citizens in the streets. Within 2 weeks, a breach was made in the city walls. The caliph's spirit broke. He sent out his son with an offer of surrender. It was too late. Hulagu demanded the caliph's unconditional personal submission. On February 10th, 1258, Al-Mustasim, accompanied by his 3 sons and a retinue of over 300 courtiers, emerged from the city and prostrated himself before the Mongol prince. For 3 days, the Mongols systematically sacked the city. The horrors were beyond description. The population, estimated at nearly 1 million, was subjected to an orgy of slaughter, rape, and enslavement. The streets became rivers of blood and debris. The stench of death hung over the city for weeks. The vast treasures of the Abbasids were loaded onto a train of wagons that stretched for miles. Then came the final, symbolic act. Hulagu had the captured caliph brought before him. There is a Mongol taboo against spilling royal blood on the earth. Showing a macabre creativity, Hulagu had Al-Mustasim and his sons rolled in carpets. Some accounts say carpets, others felt rugs, and trampled to death by horses. The last Abbasid caliph was crushed, his death a metaphor for the utter annihilation of the institution he represented. The fall of Baghdad was more than a military conquest. It was a cataclysm. The intellectual and cultural heart of the Islamic world had been torn out. The institution of the caliphate, a unifying force for half a millennium, was extinguished. The psychic shockwave reverberated from Spain to India. For the Muslim world, it was the end of an era, a trauma from which it would take centuries to recover. For the Mongols, it was the ultimate demonstration of their power. They had not only conquered empires, they had erased history itself. The city of peace was a city of the dead, and the shadow of the Mongol horse now fell across the pyramids of Egypt and the gates of Vienna. The world had never seemed so small or so terrified. while his brother Hulagu was extinguishing the caliphate in Baghdad. The great Khan monk was embarking on his own, even more monumental task: the final conquest of the Song dynasty of southern China. This was the hungry wolf of the steppe facing the ancient, sophisticated dragon. The Song were the inheritors of a continuous civilization stretching back 3,000 years. They were the most technologically advanced, populous, and wealthy society on Earth, masters of gunpowder, naval warfare, and a bureaucracy of immense complexity. Their capital, Hangzhou, was a city of fabled beauty, with canals, palaces, and a culture of exquisite refinement. To defeat them would be the ultimate validation of a Mongol way. Monk Khan did not delegate this campaign. He led it himself, a sign of its supreme importance. In 1257, he moved his court to the front line in Sichuan province, directing operations with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his grandfather. This was a different kind of war. The terrain of southern China, a labyrinth of rivers, canals, flooded rice paddies, and fortified mountain cities, was a nightmare for the Mongol cavalry. The climate was humid and pestilential, a stark contrast to the dry, cold air of the steppe. The Song were masters of defense. Their cities were protected by massive, sloping walls of stone and brick, designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment. Their armies were vast, disciplined, and equipped with gunpowder weapons, fire lances, primitive grenades, and bombs that the Mongols had never before encountered. The Mongol advance became a brutal, grinding war of attrition, a series of protracted sieges that consumed men and resources at an alarming rate. Monk, the tireless administrator, threw himself into the campaign. He personally supervised the siege of the key fortress of Jiayu Castle, a mountain stronghold that defied the Mongols for months. He studied maps, interrogated prisoners, and drove his engineers to find solution. The campaign was a test of his entire system. The Mongol army adapted, building its own fleet of riverboats to contest the Song navy and employing its Chinese engineers to construct ever larger siege engines. But the cost was immense. The humid air-bred disease, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria that ravaged the Mongol camps as effectively as any Song army. Back in the west, Hulagu, fresh from his triumph in Baghdad, continued his march. He swept through Syria, capturing the great city of Damascus without a fight. The Crusader states, seeing the wind blowing from the east, prudently chose neutrality or even alliance with the Mongols. The Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt was the last remaining Muslim power of any consequence. In 1260, Hulagu's forces crushed the Ayyubid army at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The path to Egypt and then across North Africa seemed open. The Mongol Empire was on the verge of becoming a truly global power, stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Then, in August 1259, a messenger from the east, his horse foundering, his face etched with exhaustion and grief, arrived at Hulagu's camp in Syria. He carried news that would change the course of history. The great Khan monk was dead. He had died 2 months earlier, on August 11th, 1259, during the siege of Jiayu Castle. The official cause was dysentery or cholera, contracted from the foul water in the besieged landscape. Some whispered of a wound from Song projectile. The exact cause didn't matter. The result was the same. The central pillar of the empire had fallen. The law of the Yasa was unequivocal. Hulagu, as a senior prince, was required to return to Mongolia for the election of the new great Khan. The order was a brutal choice: abandon a campaign of historic conquest at its moment of triumph, or defy the fundamental law of the empire and risk civil war. Hulagu was a loyal son of the empire. He made his decision. He withdrew from Syria with the bulk of his army, leaving behind only a small contingent, perhaps 10,000 men, under his general Kitbuka to hold the newly conquered territories. This withdrawal was a gift to the Mamluks of Egypt. Seizing the opportunity, their Sultan Qutuz and the brilliant general Baibars marched north. They met Kitbuka's isolated force at the Spring of Goliath, Ain Jalut, in September 1260. The Mongols, for the first time, faced an enemy that had studied their tactics and matched their mobility. The Mamluks, themselves slave soldiers of steppe origin, fought with a ferocity that stunned the Mongols. Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mongol army was annihilated. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not a large battle by Mongol standards, but its symbolic impact was colossal. The myth of Mongol invincibility was broken. The Mongol advance in the west was permanently halted. The dragon of the song had, through a tragic twist of fate, been saved by the death of the wolf that hunted it. The empire, which had moved as one under a single will, was now fracturing. The death of Monk had not just ended a campaign. It had ended the unity of the Mongol world. The great tide was receding, leaving rival khanates in its wake. The hungry wolf was dead, and his pups were about to turn on each other. The death of Monk Khan did not just create a power vacuum. It shattered the very lens through which the Mongol Empire viewed itself. The concept of a unified Yek Monghol Ulus, the great Mongol nation, bound by the Yasa and loyal to a single great Khan, fractured along the fault lines of its own vastness. The world was too large, the prizes too great, for the wolves to continue sharing the hunt. The crisis was immediate. Two brothers, Kublai and Erik Bok, stood as the principal contenders. Kublai, who had been commanding the eastern wing of the Song campaign, was a man who had embraced Chinese culture, surrounding himself with Confucian advisors and Buddhist monks. He saw the future of the empire not on the steppe, but in the wealthy, sedentary civilizations they had conquered. He had his own power base in northern China and declared himself Khan at his headquarters in Kaiping, later Xanadu. Erik Bok, the youngest brother, was the traditionalist. He remained in the Mongolian homeland, supported by the conservative steppe aristocracy who viewed Kublai's Sinicization with deep suspicion. They saw him as the legitimate heir, guardian of the pure Mongol way, and he was proclaimed Khan in the traditional capital of Karakorum. The empire was plunged into a bloody civil war, a conflict between two visions of the future. It was a war of logistics and attrition. Kublai, controlling the agricultural wealth of northern China, could supply his armies with ease. Erik Bok, stranded on the resource-poor steppe, saw his support wither. The fighting ravaged the Mongolian heartland, the very soil Genghis Khan had unified. In 1264, after 4 years of struggle, Erik Bok surrendered. Kublai, magnanimous in victory but ruthless in ensuring it, had his brother imprisoned, and he died under mysterious circumstances 2 years later. But Kublai's victory was hollow. The other branches of the Golden family had watched the Toluid Civil War with alarm and opportunism. They no longer saw the Great Khan in Karakorum or Xanadu as their supreme ruler. The Golden Horde, Burke, Bada's brother and a convert to Islam, was enraged by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad, a fellow Muslim city. He formed an alliance with the Mamluks of Egypt, the very people who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut. The Golden Horde in Russia and the Ilkhanate in Persia now fought a bitter war against each other in the Caucasus, a conflict that dragged on for decades. The unity of the Western Front was irrevocably broken. The Chagatai Khanate, The Central Asian domains of Chagatai became a chaotic buffer zone, their khans often playing the other khanates against each other, their allegiance shifting with the wind. They became the embodiment of the fractured whole, never strong enough to dominate, but always a disruptive force. The Ilkhanate, Hulagu and his descendants ruled Persia as virtually independent monarchs. They continued to pay lip service to the Great Khan, but they pursued their own foreign policy, fought their own wars, and adopted the culture of their subjects, eventually converting to Islam. Kublai Khan understood that the center of gravity had shifted. In 1271, he made a momentous declaration. He formally established the Yuan dynasty, a Chinese imperial dynasty with its capital at Canbalak, modern Beijing. He was now the Emperor of China, the Son of Heaven. He completed the conquest of the Song in 1279, finally achieving his grandfather's dream of uniting all of China under one rule. He built a magnificent capital, patronized the arts, and received emissaries from across the world, including a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. Yet, for all his splendor, his authority was limited. His attempted invasions of Japan were destroyed by typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds. His expeditions into Southeast Asia achieved little. The other khanates ignored his decrees. The unified empire was a memory. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, he was the master of China, but he was no longer the great Khan of the Mongols. The empire of Genghis Khan was gone. In its place stood four great khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, and a multitude of smaller ones. They were bound by tenuous bloodlines and a shared, fearsome history, but they were rivals, often at war. The shadow of the wolf had fallen across the world, but the wolf itself was now divided, its pups snarling over the remains of the conquests. The eternal sky had granted dominion to one man, a genius of will and organization. But his heirs could not command the same heaven. They had conquered the world, but they could not conquer their own ambition. The legacy of Genghis Khan was not a single, enduring empire, but a cataclysm that had reshaped the continents, shattered old orders, and left a changed world in its wake. A world forever marked by the brief, terrifying unity of the Mongols. Kublai Khan's death in 1294 was not like the death of his grandfather. There was no desperate secrecy, no river diverted to hide a sacred tomb. He died in his magnificent palace in Canbalak, the heart of his Yuan dynasty, surrounded by Chinese courtiers and the trappings of an ancient civilization he had adopted and conquered. His passing was the closing of a dynastic cycle, the end of an emperor. But for the wider Mongol world, it was the final, quiet period at the end of a thunderous sentence. The idea of a unified, step-based empire answering to a single great Khan was now a ghost. The Khanates did not simply coexist. They ossified, each succumbing to the gravitational pull of the cultures they had subjugated. Asterisk in Persia, the Ilkhans, who had once boiled caliphs and sacked Baghdad, became patrons of Persian poetry, miniature painting, and Islamic architecture. They converted to Islam, their Mongol identity slowly dissolving into the complex tapestry of their realm. The memory of Hulagu's wrath became a dark legend, a historical scar, while his descendants ruled as Persian-style shahs. Asterisk on the Russian steppes, the Golden Horde grew rich, taxing the Slavic principalities. The Mongols, the Tatars to the Russians, became a distant, oppressive aristocracy. They too converted to Islam, and their capital at Sarai became a center of Islamic learning and trade. but they remained a separate, ruling class, their power eventually crumbling not from external defeat, but from internal fragmentation, giving rise to smaller khanates like the Crimea and Kazan. Asterisk in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate remained the most staunchly Mongol, a bastion of the old ways. But it was also the poorest and most politically unstable, a cauldron of feuding clans. It became a land of shadows, its power ebbing and flowing, until it was eventually eclipsed by a new world shaper rising from within its own ranks. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, a Turk who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and sought to mimic his cruelty and conquests, but could never reassemble the true empire. Asterisk, and in China, the Yuan dynasty founded by Kublai lasted for less than a century. The Mongols remained an alien ruling class, separate from the Han Chinese majority. They were resented for their heavy taxes and their refusal to fully integrate. In 1368, a massive popular rebellion, fueled by famine and nationalist fervor, drove the last Yuan emperor back to the steppe. The Mongols, who had conquered the world's most populous nation, were expelled from it, retreating to their ancestral homeland to fragment into warring factions once more. The great systems that Genghis Khan had built, the Yasa, the Yam, the Decimal Army, rotted away without the relentless will to maintain them. The Pax Mongolica, the brief era of transcontinental security that had allowed ideas, technologies, and diseases to flow from east to west along the Silk Road, gradually dissolved. The world, which the Mongols had made smaller, began to grow vast again. Yet, the echo of their passage was indelible. The blacksmith's son from the Onan River had not just conquered land, he had rerouted the flow of history. He had connected Europe to China in a way that sparked the imagination of a continent, ultimately inspiring the age of exploration. The gunpowder his armies used and refined would revolutionize warfare. The administrative structures of his empire left marks on government from Russia to Persia. But the deepest legacy was one of pure, unadulterated power. For a few brief decades, a single will have been imposed upon a quarter of the human race. It was a demonstration that no wall, no army, no faith, and no tradition was invulnerable. The world learned that from the vast, empty spaces of the earth, a force could emerge so disciplined, so ruthless, and so innovative that it could break every civilization it touched. Today, on the wind-swept Mongolian plateau, the sky is still endless and blue. The grass still whispers the same secrets. In the center of Ulaanbaatar's Sukh-Bator Square stands a massive, imposing statue of Genghis Khan, a national icon. He is no longer the demon, the scourge of God of Western chronicles. He is the father of the nation. His true tomb, somewhere in the embrace of the Kenai Mountains, remains undiscovered, its secret kept by the land as he intended. It is perhaps for the best. To find it would be to reduce him to bones and artifacts, to something finite and knowable. And Genghis Khan was never finite. But the deepest legacy was one of pure, unadulterated power. For a few brief decades, a single will have been imposed upon a quarter of the human race. It was a demonstration that no wall, no army, no faith, and no tradition was invulnerable. The world learned that from the vast, empty spaces of the earth, a force could emerge so disciplined, so ruthless, and so innovative that it could break every civilization it touched. Today, on the wind-swept Mongolian plateau, the sky is still endless and blue. The grass still whispers the same secrets. In the center of Ulaanbaatar's Sukh-Bator Square stands a massive, imposing statue of Genghis Khan, a national icon. He is no longer the demon, the scourge of God of Western chronicles. He is the father of the nation. His true tomb, somewhere in the embrace of the Kenai Mountains, remains undiscovered, its secret kept by the land as he intended. It is perhaps for the best. To find it would be to reduce him to bones and artifacts, to something finite and knowable. And Genghis Khan was never finite. He was a force. He was the boy who saw a world tree in a dream and spent his life making it real. He was the architect who built a state from the shattered pieces of tribal conflict. He was the general whose strategies are still studied in war colleges. He was the ruler whose laws brought a brutal peace to a lawless land. He was the wolf. And long after the empires of his descendants crumbled to dust, long after the names of kings and caliphs he defeated were footnotes in history books, the wind still carries his name. It is a name that does not speak of cities built or art patronized, but of will, the sheer, terrifying, world-altering power of a single, unbreakable will born under the eternal blue sky. He was a force. He was the boy who saw a world tree in a dream and spent his life making it real. He was the architect who built a state from the shattered pieces of tribal conflict. He was the general whose strategies are still studied in war colleges. He was the ruler whose laws brought a brutal peace to a lawless land. He was the wolf. And long after the empires of his descendants crumbled to dust, long after the names of kings and caliphs he defeated were footnotes in history books, the wind still carries his name. It is a name that does not speak of cities built or art patronized, but of will, the sheer, terrifying, world-altering power of a single, unbreakable will born under the eternal blue sky.